You're listening to an In Focus podcast production.
I'm Stuart, and I'm the uncle.
And I'm Richard, and I'm the nephew.
And together,
we are
the Frustrated Authors. So let's set the scene. My father,
that's my grandfather,
published 10 novels.
And countless short stories.
And me and my brothers thought we'd easily be able to do the same.
But none of them did. Now I've got the bug too.
So we're going to chat about our favourite books,
what gets in the way of our own writing,
and about whatever else comes to our minds.
So welcome to the first edition of The
Frustrated Authors. Richard, we've talked about doing this for a while.
I know, this must be what, six months in the making, I reckon.
And now we're doing it in Falkirk,
I know,
where I was born.
Yes, yeah.
Where your grandfather lost the inspiration for writing.
Yeah.
The family rumour was that, the family rumour, I was told directly that my birth put a stop to his writing career.
Yeah, I'd heard that. I'd obviously heard from my mother that it was the TV in the living room as well that helped.
Probably a combination of the two. But it's interesting though, because from a very early age I knew that Dad had written books. And there were the books on the bookcase in the living room.
Yeah.
And it kind of made being an author not very special. Hey, Dad's an author.
Yeah.
Anybody can be an author, except me.
Yeah, I think.
And you.
Yeah, well, that's it. When I've probably had a similar sort of experience knowing that he had written books, and then when you actually sit down to try and do it yourself, you realise it's not that easy. Did you read a lot of his books growing up?
Not growing up. I've kind of read them more recently.
Yeah.
And I know your mum's done the same. I've tried to put together through eBay and Amazon, some of his stuff comes up for sale. And I bought bits and pieces because obviously I've got 3 children and my aim is to try and curate a full set for them each.
Okay.
I haven't actually done any buying for a while.
So how many have you got so far?
So I've got, I think, 2 full sets and a few which would go towards the third set.
I've got one through in the kitchen there, Chindhook Mission or something.
Chindhook Mission, yes.
Yeah. So I've not actually read it, but it's on display.
And it was fascinating because a lot of the stuff, well, all the novels were based on Second World War stories.
Yeah.
Because obviously he was 18 in 1939. Should perhaps say his name was Peter Baillie. So he was 18 in 1939, was called up at the outbreak of war, in fact I think even slightly before the outbreak of war, and went through the whole of the Second World War. So that's where a lot of the inspiration for writing came.
So had he written anything before the war, or was it all just after
it was all just after.
Oh, right, that's interesting.
Then he also wrote a lot of science fiction, which was very big in the 1950s, and that was published in magazines and books. So yeah, those were his 2.
See, that's I never knew he'd written any science fiction until quite recently when you told me, and because I've tried to read, I think there's another book that we had in the house growing up, Assault Patrol I think it was called.
Yep.
So when I was younger I tried to read that, but I think with the style of it wasn't the most engaging for maybe 15-year-old growing up in the 2000s. But I'm not a massive reader of war stories or war fiction, but I really like science fiction, so I'd be quite interested to try and find some of these science fiction to read.
There may be some of it kicking about because it tended to be magazines and short story based rather than full novels. Mm-hmm. I was aware of a lot less of it in the house when I was growing up. But yeah, he and my mother went off to science fiction conventions and all the rest of it.
Were they dressed up?
Because it was a big genre in the time.
It just reminds me, I was at the train station in Falkirk the other day and I saw there was a mother dressed as some Star Wars character with her little daughter. They were obviously off to some sort of convention. I hope they were going to a convention, but they...
And not just to Tesco's.
Yeah. But I could just imagine Granny Granny dressed up in something similar.
Yeah, I can't. Strangely. But yes, as I said, the fact that he had published works kind of demystified the whole thing. I do remember him talking once about the fact that they were in London, and he decided that while they were in London, he would go and visit his publisher.
All right.
Expecting this to be some huge glass-fronted, multi-storey building, but was actually just a basement office somewhere in Soho.
So it wasn't one of the big publishing houses.
Yes, it was one of the big
What was his publisher called?
Digit Books. Around the time of my birth, so late 50s, early 60s, he was commissioned by Collins to write a book, and what they wanted was the story of a young man from the late 1930s through the Second World War. And I was having read the material that Dad had done, obviously someone identified him. So he often talked about the fact, oh yes, Collins asked me to write, but he never did. Until shortly before he died. Is
this the one I think you sent me the photocopied manuscript of?
Yes.
Yeah, so I've read parts of that, yeah.
And it's virtually an autobiography.
Is it?
From where it picks up. But for dramatic purposes, he kills off my mother.
Oh, does he?
which your dad was never particularly happy about.
What was Granny? How were her thoughts on that?
I think she accepted it for what it was. But she had been scheduled to go to a service at the Guards Chapel in London when famously the first
I think I've heard
V1 Doodlebug came across.
I remember her telling me this.
And killed lots of people, so she could have been amongst those. But at the last minute was had to go and help a friend who was ill or something. But Dad, for the purposes of the book, decided that she did go to the Guards Chapel. And there's this wonderful final scene where he visits her grave. As I talk about it, it's being raising the hairs at the back of my neck.
Yeah, I can see it, because you can see you look physically affected by it.
So he goes to visit her grave and then walks out the graveyard into the future and obviously into the second book that was never written.
No. Well, I'd say I've got the manuscript, so I should really read the whole thing through, because I read the start, the school days bit. I think it was at Bonnybridge or
Longcroft Primary.
Longcroft Primary. I'm sure there's a bit about the Bonnie Water in it though.
There will be, because they went fishing along the Bonnie Water. And of course when he left school he went to work in an iron foundry along the banks of the canal in Bonnybridge. So he set it and describes it all pretty accurately.
So that was it, and it was a scene with his head teacher or something, and he's in the last day of school or something like that.
It seems amazing. He included it in the story, and I heard the story numerous times, and it to me kind of these days beggars belief. But he and two colleagues on the last day of primary school, which I think they were about 12. Primary school lasted a bit longer than it does today, were summoned to the headmaster's office because they were seen to be the top of the year group or the top of the class, and were asked if they wanted to go to high school.
All right, so was primary school kind of the end of education for a lot of people?
Yes, I thought it was their last day of school, and only kind of those who were seen as being good enough were given the option to go to high school. And the way he told the story, he said it was quite obvious that the other two, the three of them were waiting for one of them to say, yes please, and then they'd have said, but none of them did. So none of them went to high school. But the fact that the parents weren't involved in that, these days, it's staggering.
There'd be an uproar if that happened now. The parents
you leave a 13-year-old to make a decision that's going to...
We all pay all this money to live in houses next to nice high schools, not for the kids to decide whether they want to go or not.
Exactly. So that seems. So he left. I think that was the Friday. He left school and started work on the Monday.
In the foundry.
In the foundry.
And do you think he wrote a lot? So you're saying he didn't really write anything or get anything published till after. Do you think he must have been writing as a young man as well? Do you think he started writing when he? But I personally, I didn't start. I used to read a lot as a teenager, But unlike you, I thought there was this mystical thing. I thought no idea how you could write a book, and I never attempted to write anything until I went to university, and then I should have been writing history essays, and I decided that was at the time I wanted to write novels instead. And I was, I think it was maybe some sort of self-sabotage that, I was quite good at writing history essays, so I thought I'm going to do this.
If you'd like to find more of our podcasts and see the range of subjects we cover, then please search In Focus Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts.
We went through this phase where it was in the early days of email, and almost every morning I would wake up and Bill would have sent me another couple of poems that he'd written over the last couple of days. And he wrote this one based on one of his journeys to work, and he'd seen this kind of woman, vagrant, rough sweeping woman at the top of the White Sands in Dumfries where we lived at the time. And basically the poem was about her and her situation, and how bad he felt about the conditions that she was living in. And as soon as I read that, I kind of thought, there's a story behind that. Yeah. There's a story behind how she got there. Mm-hmm. And so between us, I think I probably did most of the actual writing, but between us we started exploring that subject, and we did actually complete 100,000 words.
So you wrote that together?
Yes.
How did you find the experience of writing together as in a partnership instead of... I've always thought that writing is more of a solo activity.
I think largely it is, and I think we wrote... I probably actually wrote most of the words. Mm-hmm. We would... I suppose because he created the key character, he created two key characters, and I suppose because of that we chatted about it. But a really funny story relating to that, there's a character in the poem who's just referred to in the poem as a psycho called Sid.
All right.
And this is the father of this woman's child, and so in the poem he's a psycho, but when you actually start writing the novel and you're going back 10 years, he's actually quite a nice guy.
Okay.
And a lot of the novel was set in Carlisle, and we drove down to Carlisle one Sunday, and to check out plot lines and where the police station was and things like that. And so we've been spending the afternoon talking about plot and character and all the rest of it. And I remember we were standing in a queue to get a coffee in Costa or wherever it was at the time, and I heard myself saying to him, "But do you think we really can stab him?" And and this woman in the queue behind us kind of looked. And we were just so wrapped up in talking about the plot of this story.
It became real life.
That you kind of forget what else is going on.
Did she take a step back when you said that?
Probably because of a mobile phone in those days, she'd phoned the police.
Aye. But yeah, because I've obviously had experience trying to write a couple of novels with my Uncle Jim, and I've always found that the initial collaboration's been quite good because you're bouncing ideas off each other. But what tended to happen there was that we'd end up with two different novels, one that he'd come up with, one that I'd come up with, and I would try and sort of weld them together into this one, and it never worked.
Yeah.
And the approach to it was, I feel like we had very different approaches, whereas he was very almost scientific in the way he wrote the book, wanted to write the book, and it was very much like an engineer, and he was constructing a plot, this sort of edifice, this plot edifice, and the structure, and then you would just put the characters into it where they needed to go, whereas I was thinking, I was approaching it much more from a character-driven point of view.
Creative point of view.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Because Jim is, he's an electronics engineer.
Yeah.
So I suppose that is his approach. Where
I found it interesting because there was certain things where I struggle with writing, which he actually would really help, which is he's very inventive, and so come out with actual inventions. He came up with this little spider thing that would go across the ground detecting metal, which was going to be, these metal detectorists had invented it, and our antagonist steals their invention and tries to sell it off as his own. So he could come up with things that I could never imagine, but that's where I think it's more of a solo project, because that's his book to write. But we were trying to do it together, and it was a lot of fun to do, and I enjoyed it, but it just never quite felt like it was a proper
full ownership of it.
Yeah, or I was trying to write something that he wasn't trying to write, and that's made me kind of think I've always wanted to do my writing on my own.
I think with Bill and I, because he came up with the poem, I think, which kind of gave me the inspiration, and then we also we were both, one of the reasons why it was based in Carlisle is because we were both doing a lot of judo at the time.
All right.
At a club in Carlisle, and we kind of used judo as a little bit of a backdrop to the story.
Yeah.
So the psycho called Sid, for example, is actually a Commonwealth gold medal judo player who meets this woman and his life goes to hell. Ultimately, he becomes a drug addict.
So does she? Okay, so he's on the straight and narrow, and he meets her, and she's the catalyst for the descent of his life.
All his ills.
Or down to a woman.
Yes, sounds fairly typical. So yeah, and that's where that went. But I think I mentioned to you earlier that you get to know your character so well as you're doing it.
Yeah.
And I wrote this book not from start to finish, but as I got an idea for a scene at some point in the storyline, I would write that scene, and then we had lots of scenes that we kind of stitched together with sort of linking dialogue and things. And I remember one of the first scenes I'd written was something close to the end of the story, and then after a couple of months or whatever it was that we'd been working on this, rereading it, I remember saying, no, he wouldn't do that. You get to know your character so well that you know that's not them, that's not the way they would behave. Yeah,
and that's certainly the way I was approaching writing, was that so your characters are in a situation and their personality dictates how that situation will go. Whereas, as I say, Jim was more, we'll have this situation and the characters sort of are fixed onto the situation. Whereas I very much the character decides where the story goes. But I find it interesting that even just where to start a novel. I've started things, or even the short story, and you start writing it and you go, actually I need to go a wee bit further back. I need to go a wee bit further back. And it's really difficult to actually find where your story starts.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think that's possibly why with this one, we caught the working title was Death's Final Repose. And I think the way that came together was that because the poem that gave me the inspiration was sort of towards the end of the story, so we were taking what Bill had seen that morning and then going 10 years before, so it was easier to write a couple of scenes towards the end of the story, and then you started thinking back about, well, how did you get there, and you kind of almost went back in steps, so it was almost in reverse order, and almost the start of the story was written towards the end of the process.
And there's always that you've got the story, but then you've got the backstory. And it's about how much of the backstory you include, because you're going to have all this knowledge of the character that might not even get into the book, but you have it, even if you're not fully conscious of it, you're aware of it in your mind, that you have that feeling of the character.
I mean, I'm sure a good editor would have removed this particular chunk, but as I say, we used judo as a sort of background to the story, and there's one particular sequence that we wrote where Sid's reaching the peak of his judo career just before everything's going to go to pieces for him, and he's fighting in the final of the Commonwealth Games, and Bill and I were actually standing there in the kitchen sort of mapping out this fight. And then so we'd get hold of each other, and so and you'd put the hand there, and then we'd write down what we'd done, and then he'd put his arm over there and his leg there, and we'd write that down, so that we actually sort of got the choreography and everything right.
Did his wife walk in at any point?
But it was probably very self-indulgent. As I say, I think a good editor would probably whip that one straight.
Yeah, I think that's another thing. I was talking to my friend about this the other day when we were hiking, and you obviously read everything. All the books you read have been through a process of editing and self-editing and drafts, and I find that sometimes is you're comparing what you're writing to the finished product, and that can be quite you have to sort of shut that out, like this isn't great, but it's because it's not been through that entire process to get it to a point where it's ready to be published. Which, it's a confidence thing, really, isn't it? Having confidence in your work, and I think that's probably the biggest hurdle to any writer, is having the confidence to kind of keep going with something.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy just to think, oh, this is crap compared to...
And I think sometimes you have a bad day or a bad session, but it's going back and working beyond that point. So maybe you're advancing the story, but then going back at some stage later,
yeah,
and reviewing what you're not happy with. I guess one of the funny things was we always had a typewriter in the house, and I remember from as early as I could, I remember knowing how to put the paper in and go up, and I would always do my homework at the typewriter.
Your teachers must have loved you.
I
can remember it must have been about 19. I was at college and handed in this essay. It was all handwritten, and my tutor gave me it back and says, "I've marked it this time, but if you don't type it up the next time, I'm not doing it."
But yeah, I remember sitting there winding in a bit of paper and trying to come up with a story as 7, 8, 9-year-old, whatever I was. So yeah, that thought, I suppose, had always been there. And Dad was a huge reader, and as we were growing up, we lived in a house full of books. So there were always books. He was always reading something. So there was fact, fiction, whatever. I remember your dad, for example, was a huge American politics fan, particularly a big fan of Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
And we had a few books in the house.
Who I am not named after Richard Nixon, just to clarify that. I've asked him a few times, did you name me after Richard Nixon?
He wasn't that much of a fan.
Because I'll be going down and I'll be using my middle name if that was the case. I still think I am. I think he was, on some level, he must have named me after Richard Nixon.
Subconscious.
Yeah.
He was, as I say, he was a huge fan of Nixon's, and would go on at length about why Nixon wasn't the bad guy that everybody.
Yeah, I've certainly. I mean, there's a book over there that he gave me. So it's Richard Nixon, The Life. I remember we bought him. It was a 3-part biography of Nixon that he was desperate to read. So we got him at, I think, must have got him at 3. Maybe 2 bits for Christmas, 1 for his birthday or something. But he certainly was a Nixon aficionado. Is that how you put it?
Very much so. But that thing about having books in the house, you reading was again a natural process. If writing was a bit of anybody could do that, reading even more so. It was just something that we did, and I think you read a lot from a fairly young age as well.
Yeah, I mean, I actually struggled with reading when I was quite young, and then it was, I think with a lot of people my age, it was Harry Potter. I started reading Harry Potter books, and then when I was a teenager and a kid, I would just reread Harry Potter and the books that we're maybe going to talk about today, Adrian Mole. So I didn't read a huge amount of books. I was almost always in a cycle. I'd read Harry Potter, then I would read Adrian Mole, and I remember reading I had a copy of Goodnight Mr. Tom, and I really liked that book growing up, so I read that. But I was almost sort of scared to go and try and read other books, so I would just kind of try and get any other books I read. That's pretty much up until I was about 16, and then I started branching out and reading a lot of other books. But I still go back to read Adrian Mole and Harry Potter. Maybe every 5 years I'll go back and read them.
I think the stuff. I mean, interestingly, you suggested that I read Adrian Mole, and one of the books I've suggested to you is Catcher in the Rye, which was a book I first read when I was about 14 or 15, and it's about an American school kid. He's 16. Clearly, the fact that he's in adolescence is affecting lots of what he does. But that's a book that really sparked my interest. I sort of kind of identified with the character, some of the storyline, elements of the storyline, and I read that probably on an annual basis for many years. And when you do get round to read it, I'll be interested to hear what you think, because...
Well, I have read it in the past.
Right.
I must have read it, I must be about 23 or 24 when I read it. So I have read it, but it's a good 10 years ago.
Yeah. But I have this theory that if you read Catcher in the Rye as an adolescent, you'll love it because it speaks very much to you. And there's a few adults I've known who haven't read it until in the 30s and 40s, and they've hated it because they think it's just a load of nonsense.
See, it's quite interesting. I think that about Harry Potter. Like, I wouldn't read the first couple of Harry Potter books anymore because they are very juvenile. But I think, and when I go back and I read them now, they are very, especially the style of writing. It's pretty unremarkable style of writing. You know, it's not, especially she's a lot of adverbs in it, and but I still love reading them because they're very nostalgic books, and the plot's great and the characters are great in it as well. But I think a lot of, if you haven't read them as an adolescent and you try to read them as an adult, I don't think you would get the same enjoyment out of them. But then I suppose a lot of adults did really enjoy the Harry Potter books.
Which is perhaps why the style changed as they progressed, because the market was possibly changing away from being just a children's story to being something that had appeal to a wider age range.
I remember there's a quote from Stephen King, and he's talking about the fourth book, and he was a big fan of J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter books, but he said he specifically mentions that she uses a hell of a lot of adjectives. I can't remember the exact quote, but he brings it up. But I've also read his book on writing, and that's one of the things he's very much don't use adjectives when you don't have to. So you do see the progression of her style.
Yeah.
And that's when I go back to reread them, I pretty much start on the fourth or the fifth book and just sort of read the later books. Yeah, because the earlier books are children's books.
There are also books that really have, people get really engaged and engrossed in them, and there's a good friend of mine who won't mind me saying that he is very badly dyslexic, and one of the few series of books he's read are the Harry Potter books. Yeah. And he said he just, although he really struggles with reading, he enjoyed them so much that it was kind of worth
that was
the effort.
That was
to get through them.
I didn't get diagnosed with dyslexia until I went to university, so I was about 21. So that's probably one of the reasons why I didn't read a lot of other books. And I found the Harry Potter books a lot more accessible, and the Adrian Mole books a lot more accessible. And then later on I did get diagnosed with dyslexia, but I can remember being a child and there was Goosebumps books they were called, and trying to read them and just really struggling to visualise what I was reading. But I didn't seem to have that same problem with Harry Potter. But I sometimes think that might be because the films were coming out at the same time, so you were almost, it was sort of easier to kind of visualise it because you had the film there as well. So there was a cross-pollination between the film and the books, which made it easier to visualise the setting.
I suppose it does, yes. Takes that little bit away from the imagination. Yeah,
but it was quite interesting because my image of Hogwarts isn't like it is in the film, and it was a few years ago. And I was going for a jog around on Lithgow Loch, and I was round the other side of the loch, and I was looking over at the palace, and I must have been rereading the Harry Potter books at the time, and I kind of looked over at the palace, and I realised that my vision, like my imagination of Hogwarts, was just a slightly more grandiose palace. It was the lawns, and I realised that I was just sort of slightly exaggerating the palace in my mind, and then removing the town around it. And so there's always that. And I think when you're reading a book, you always draw on what's around you for imagery.
I think that's also why often when you see, if you've read the book first, then you see the film often disappoints because the setting is not what you thought it was. Yeah. And I can think of a number of books I've read over the years, and then you get excited because the film's coming out, and you think, actually, that's not how I thought it would be.
That was it's great because there's the Hogwarts computer game, and so I was playing that, and you're playing it, and that's based on the film Hogwarts. But I also had, that was slightly disappointing because it's not my Hogwarts, it's not how I imagine Hogwarts. But obviously the computer game developers can't superimpose my imagination into the game.
And every individual's imagination,
not yet anyway, maybe one day. But I've also had it with Lord of the Rings, where I've watched the films first and I've never really been able to read the books. I think maybe partly the style is very long-winded.
I've always found Tolkien a really difficult read. I've read The Hobbit, And I think one of the reasons why I read The Hobbit was because it didn't seem as daunting as Lord of the Rings. But yeah, I've never been able to get into Lord of the Rings.
No.
It just feels...
I mean, I love the films, and because I'm sure my parents had a copy of Lord of the Rings. I don't think my dad ever read it.
Lord of the Rings is one of those books that everybody did have.
Yeah.
I think there was a book club way back in the 80s or the 90s, and with your first order they gave you a free copy, and it was usually there was this little set of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and that was quite often the free gift.
Might have been that.
So I think that's why kind of every house had it.
Yeah, I think it was all 3 books in one.
Yes.
So they had. So I can remember trying to read that after the films, and then not really. I say giving up very early. I didn't even get out of Hobbiton. Because there's a lot of like descriptions of family, like lineage, hobbits, and very much like deep lore of the world, but not a lot of kind of narrative flow. Yeah, there's not a lot going on. But I've been told if you get past that, it does get really good. But I've tried it a couple of times, never really got very far, and then I tried to do it with the audiobook, which has got Andy Serkis as the narrates it, and he played Gollum in the film. And I got a wee bit further in, but I just sort of got bored of it as well. Yeah. But it's all part of it's like because I've seen the films, I'm like, I know what's going to happen. So
yes, this is an effort that's not worth making.
Yeah, I think so. Whereas when you read a book first, then see a film, I think it's a totally different experience.
If you'd like to find more of our podcasts and see the range of subjects we cover, then please search In Focus Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts.
I mean, let's talk a little bit about Moe, because you mentioned Adrian Moe. And I remember when the first book came out, which must have been the mid-1980s, from my memory, or was it later than that?
So it was set in 81, so they used to come out a few years after.
Yes.
So I think she would take a writing process, she would take notes of everything.
So I seem to remember it was about 84, 85.
Yeah, I would say 83 at the earliest. But
and it was certainly, because that was Adrian Moe, aged 13 and 3/4. Yeah. And lots of people were picking it up and lots of people were raving about it, and I remember reading it and enjoying it. But I'm sure a lot of people listening, and I'm sure you will think I must have spent my life under a stone, because I didn't realise there were quite so many subsequent books.
Yeah, from my understanding, I wasn't born, but my understanding is they were almost like the Harry Potter of the 80s, weren't they? They were this sort of cultural phenomenon, maybe not quite to the same extent.
Because the TV series followed quite quickly, and then we had films, and
I'm sure there's a radio play as well.
Actually, yes, there was.
Because that's where the guy Tideman that he's talking to, he's a real person that Sue Townsend, I think, worked with. So It's a little joke with him that she has. But I don't know how prominent they were later on. They certainly made the TV show after the Cappuccino years, but maybe it became more of a cult thing, I think, maybe later on.
Possibly. The one you recommended me to read was The Wilderness Years. Yeah. And it's years, so it's donkey's years since I read my last Adrian Moe, and I loved it.
I think she's just got a knack for. She's one of my favourite writers. She's got a knack for like the comedic character.
Yep.
And it's not just Adrian. It's his mum's
all
brilliant.
The people around him.
And in this book, Mr. Brown, his boss is. I think everybody's probably worked for a Mr. Brown before. This uptight kind of micromanager that's out to get you.
But you're talking about the settings and how you picture the settings in your mind. And I had an uncle and aunt who lived in Yorkshire, and the house that they lived in, from the description in the book of the house that Adrian's mum's living in, so to me, it's Uncle Walter and Auntie Betty's house, just outside York. That's where Moe lives. I've now got that fixed in my mind.
Yeah, that is. I had a sort of like a generic sort of 70s kind of semi-detached for them in a wee cul-de-sac, and then I'd always imagine Pandora's house. So in the earlier books, she lives with her parents in a because there's so much comment on class in it. It's very much, and it's like, there's Adrian always describes himself as like lower middle class, upper working class.
Yes, I like that bit.
And then Pandora's upper middle class, and with bohemian parents that are in the Labour Party. But
and he's very class conscious.
Yeah,
he kind of slots everybody into his,
which is, I suppose, is a reflection of British society at the time.
Yep.
It probably still is. But I always imagined Pandora living in. There was a neighbour I had that lived at the bottom of the street that had a much fancier house than we did, and that was always my sort of blueprint for where Pandora's house. But I can't remember the name. Her house has got a name, but I can't remember what it is now. But it's got some pretentious sort of middle class name for their house.
Yes, and obviously she's in Oxford, so he thought, how does he end up living in her box room when clearly the relationship's going nowhere?
That's it.
Why did he allow himself? Why did she allow him to move in?
But I'm sure I think every guy's had that unrequited love. Maybe not to the same degree as Adrian, but there's always been that. I think everybody's had that experience of being infatuated with a member of the opposite sex and not being reciprocated. Yeah, and not realising that you should just kind of let that go and move on. But yeah, I try to remember how he ends up in Oxford originally, because that's in one of the other books. I think that's in True Confessions, which is the one before it. But yeah, I think he's just a classic British comedy character that's got ideas of grandeur and pretensions, but is a complete failure. Like I see him, Alan Partridge, David Brent. He's very much in that sort of mould, isn't he?
Yeah, and always he hates everybody. Or he hates aspects of everybody. When in actual fact you look at it and you think, well, actually, but really you just want to be like them. Yeah. And you can actually see that when he changes his wardrobe, for example, and finally gets rid of his blazer, he starts wearing the kind of clothes that he's been slagging people off for. Yeah, and feels much happier as a result.
There's a big thing in the next book where he's always talking about his chinos. There's quite a few, so he mentions that he wears chinos, and he shops at Next, so that sort of continues on.
Which again, at the time that was written, Next was the place to shop.
Yeah, I think this is certainly this one is his most self-deluded and kind of awkward. He sort of, in the books, as the books progress, he becomes more adjusted to life. He's never quite in the mainstream, he's never quite happy, but he sort of finds a place for himself more than he does. Because this book he's getting therapy and he's falling in love with his therapist.
Yes.
One of my favourite scenes though is when he's at the party and he's talking to the guy about his manuscript and his novel, and he says that nobody's interested. He's at this Oxford lecturers, lecturers dinner party, and he's looking down on them all because nobody wants to listen to him talk about his manuscript.
And the book's again is called
the Flat Hills of My Poem.
That's it. And it's the way that something happens to him, or he meets somebody, and that becomes the next chapter, and then he starts writing the novel within the novel.
Yeah.
And he's got all these ideas, all of these delusions of where he writes to the guy at the BBC and says, by the way, do you mind photocopying this and sending me a copy back?
But I as I say, I certainly, looking back, can relate a lot. As I say, it's obviously an extreme, exaggerated version. But like if I go back and look at what I wrote when I was in my early 20s, it's all very angsty. The world's a horrible place. I'm, almost like this undiscovered genius that nobody appreciates. And I think it's a common sort of rite of passage. Maybe not for everybody, but I think most writers probably go through that. And like you're saying, it's the same with Holding Caulfield. The sort of the feeling
the world is against it.
Yeah, the feeling of alienation. I think most writers probably have that feeling of alienation, which is probably something that drives them to write because you want to express it, but it's very difficult to do it without becoming a pretentious arse.
Yeah,
which if I read my stuff back, I certainly, I remember there's one thing I wrote and I was trying to write about the sort of, I was going out drinking a lot at university and I was trying to write something about the drinking culture, and I have this metaphorical flood in the street, but when I read it back, it's just it's so confusing because I'm labouring this metaphor to such an extreme that people are floating down the street drowning. And you're like, this just sounds like the street's flooded and everybody's drowning. And I'm like, what the heck? You just write a nice story and you can have illusions, but I was going full on with metaphorical writing to the extent where you're like, what the hell's happening? They're coming
completely impenetrable.
Yeah, there's people coming out of a pub and there's people floating down the street past them, and this is absolutely absurd. But at the time I thought I was being really profound.
Yes.
And
only legal substances have been consumed at the point of writing.
Oh, of course, yes. And then, you know, you can see that in Adrian. And I Sue Townsend, you know, she must have, you know, there's certainly going to be a load of her, and she must have went through a similar experience because I know she used to write a lot of poetry and she could never get it published, and so she put a lot of it into Adrian Mole. Whether it was more, she started leaning into the sort of comedic poetry because she can, you know, her serious stuff. But I imagine she must have went through that same sort of feeling of alienation.
I think it's possibly not just writers. Doesn't everybody to an extent go through that? Because you're at school or wherever, there's always somebody who you kind of want to be, and then sort of later life you discover that actually they always want to do you. So nobody's quite happy with their own lot, and everybody thinks somebody else's lot's better than theirs, and I think that's where a lot of the angst comes from. If you kind of don't adjust it and kind of get it out. You know, for example, nobody ever picked me to play football. I was short, fat, and wore glasses. So yeah, I was literally the last one to get picked for football, and then they put me in the goals.
Yeah.
So and you know that used to be a terrible sense of.
Oh yeah, there was that. You getting picked last.
I've been rejected.
Yeah. It was a really, if you think back, that's a really brutal way to choose teams.
But I was just useless at football.
Yeah.
I was deservedly last picked.
But that was as a kid. I mean, that was, especially a boy. That was like almost like the social hierarchy was based on how good they were at football.
Exactly. So which is why I hated them all.
I can remember, because I was alright in football, but I was never amazing. But I can remember getting to about 10 or 11 and sort of subverting it and then being like, well, I don't actually want to play football. So me and a few of the other boys would go and do other stuff, and we would just be...
Which is the kind of thing Adrian Mole would do, it's the kind of thing Holden Caulfield would do.
Yeah, you reject it.
Yes. You know, before you get to reject me, I'm going to reject you.
Yeah. And it is a defensive thing. And I think that's certainly an adolescent thing. I think that you said, I think you meet a lot of people in later life that are still like that, but I think part of becoming an adult is realising that in yourself, that you can't rail against everything that's not going your way, and that you have to sort of have a level of acceptance.
And we're all good at different things.
Yeah, that's it. Everybody's got their strengths.
Just going back to that school one briefly, looking back now, I eventually found sport in my late 20s, but anything I've been good at sporting wise is an individual sport. And I don't think I'm particularly good at team sports, whereas at school, of course, everything, and you can't expect PE teachers to introduce individual sports because you don't have the resources, but I think if I had sort of found some individual sports at school, then I might have enjoyed them, but team sports are just not me.
I certainly enjoy team sports, but there's a level of frustration in them that you don't get with individual sports because you have to rely on other people.
Yeah, exactly.
There's maybe a five-a-side game where I've shouted at someone for not running onto the ball, even though I've probably made 10 million mistakes before that as well.
Yeah, whereas if you lose at judo, it's nobody's fault. Judo.
There's not that pressure.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't drive all the way home blaming everybody else in the team. But I think that thing about writing and writers having that angst or whatever you want to call it, I think the ability to write, I think when you write something, you can write it with much more depth, much more feeling, much more emotion than you could ever say it.
Yeah.
For example, people breaking up relationships, how often, well, these days they probably don't write a letter, they probably send a text. But it was that thing about writing a letter, because somehow you can explain things better before the row starts, and it descends into that. But there's that thing, if we write something,
there's a level of distance
that
you don't get when you're communicating verbally.
Yeah.
You've got that space and you can go back and
you can explain, and you can tweak. We can refine and edit and make it better. But yeah, I've just started on your recommendation, the Cappuccino Years, which starts with him predicting that Tony Blair will get a majority of 3, and he's driving an Austin Montego.
Aye, that's I didn't even think about the book, about the car in the book, but you'd obviously be, as a car buff, you'd have been right into that.
Yes.
There's a great bit in it as well when he's I don't know if you've got to it yet, but he's they're called opal fruits at the time, and he's and he's got an opal fruit addiction.
Yes.
And he drives around London trying to find opal fruits at 3 a.m. He says, I can't find any, but I've been offered crack cocaine or something like that.
He's been offered crack cocaine, a lesbian prostitute, and a Rolex watch. But he can't find any opal.
I think she's just got a great ability to sort of to construct, like, to tap into time and space and, you know, make it come alive. Like, you know, the feeling of the late 90s and the Cappuccino years, it's really vibrant in the sort of the cheap production company that he works for, doing he becomes a TV chef, which is, you know, these sort of cheap TV shows that were all getting made in the late 90s. Obviously I wasn't born until the 88, but the feeling of reading the early books is that they really are a much more accurate portrayal of probably the everyday life in the 80s than your sort of glamorous neon, like, big suits, and, you know, the sort of the popular image of the 80s probably is not the reality for the most people.
I mean, I love was it in A.A. Gill describes him as being possibly the best offal chef, being OFFAL chef in the country.
Yeah.
And only Adrian Moore could become an awful chef.
There's another bit when he talks, and it's like he serves him a sausage, and he's like, A.A. Gill's like, it looked like a shit, it smells like a shit.
It probably is.
It's a shit, yeah.
And he boils his cabbage for an hour.
But because he becomes a chef at the end of the Wilderness years, and it's actually quite a heartwarming ending to the book. So that's the reason I really like that one is he goes through all the turbulence, and then he actually has some sort of resolution at the end of it. But because he's Adrian Mole, by the next book he's fucked all that.
He's back to square one.
You know, he's met this beautiful wife, and then there's a running thing that he was never quite able to deal with the fact that he was shorter than her.
If that had been a problem for me and wife,
so he sort of blows this. You know, he's married to this African. I think she's like a heiress to some sort of million pound fortune, and he can't get over. He can't. You know, he's got all the potential to have this brilliant life, and he ruins it for himself, and ends up back in Leicester.
Ashby de la Zouch,
yeah. And then, yeah, I'd say that my favourite book's The Weapons of Mass Destruction, which is after. So I think you'll enjoy that one as well.
I think now I'm going to have to plug on with the rest of them.
Yeah.
As I say, I simply hadn't realised there was so.
It was disappointing because she sadly passed away. I know she was writing another book, but she passed away when she was writing it, so they're never going to publish the last book. I don't know if it was going to be the last one that she'd ever written. Well, if it was intended to be the last one, but she was in the middle of writing it when she died, because the final book that was published, The Prostate Years.
The Prostate
Was it prostate or I can't remember. It was prostate because they keep getting it wrong because he's got prostate cancer. And I've got it up here.
As a gentleman of a certain age, it is prostate.
Yeah.
You prostrate yourself.
Prostrate. So it's called The Prostrate Years because everybody keeps getting prostate wrong. So he has cancer in that, and there's a really one of the most touching scenes in all the books is when at the end of that one, I won't ruin it, but as there's a slight sadness that you don't get to see what happens after that scene, because it would have been really nice to see how that played out, and I think it would have given a resolution to the entire series. But unfortunately, it's one of these things that's never going to come.
And there's a character he's so likeable. To have killed him off would have been difficult.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I think you'd have to keep him going. Mm-hmm. If she had been able to continue it, you'd have had to keep him going well into old age. But it's also the kind of story and the kind of character that has no end.
Yeah.
Because obviously we've seen him in his 20s, his mid-20s. The stories are equally relevant, and his views on society and the people in it are equally as relevant once in his 50s, once he becomes a grumpy old man like me in his 60s.
Well, I think that's the only character I can really think that's sort of similar in popular culture is Alan Partridge. You've seen him throughout his career, and it's just the same thing. There's no end. I think Alan Partridge, he's got better and better. Like, you know, he's a man in, I think Partridge is maybe 50s or 60s now, and he's just a sort of grumpy has-been DJ that's
kind of has-been who never really quite was.
And he's just petty. He's got all these petty. He's brilliant. Like, he's got a podcast. Steve Coogan does a podcast with him in his three seasons in there, and you sort of get to see the inner workings of Alan Partridge's mind in a way that you maybe don't get on the TV shows as much.
Yeah.
And because it's just Steve Coogan sitting at a microphone pretending to be Alan Partridge, and there's some of the best stuff he's ever done, because you're really just getting to see how petty and pathetic this man really is.
But I remember when Partridge emerged, it's digressing a little bit, but there was a whole host of characters that Steve Coogan did.
Mm-hmm.
Paul and Pauline Calf.
Yeah, that's it. Aye.
And then their friend Fat Bob, who worked at Mr. Clutch.
Oh, right.
And then there was Gareth Cheeseman, who drove a Ford Probe and was an 80s salesman with his Filofax and all the rest of it. The Paul and Pauline Calf characters were absolutely fantastic. I'd have loved to have seen him.
I've seen clips of that. He had the sort of blonde wigs.
Yeah, Paul had the mullet.
Yeah.
And she had the sort of big Bonnie Tyler 80s hair. And yeah, they were good characters as well.
Yeah.
He had that ability to create them. But yeah, what he's done with Partridge, the chat shows, the video Norfolk.
There's 3 books as well, so we can maybe do them in another episode. But yeah, I mean, with Adrian Mole, back to Adrian, I think just the idea of the frustrated writer, I think he encapsulates everything about trying to be a writer and not being very good at it.
Yes.
And I think that's probably the biggest thing, is like, it's always in the back of your mind, you're writing and you're thinking, am I actually any good at this? Is what I'm writing absolute nonsense?
And that's the solitary nature of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is one of the issues I've kind of got about the whole vanity publishing industry, which has grown up.
Yeah.
Anybody now, well, we're doing this podcast and we're publishing it. Is it any good? Is it not? Who knows?
We'll find out.
But you can now publish your own books without anybody making a critical judgment or assessment or making any suggestions. Whereas before, like my father, he had to find a publisher to publish them.
Yeah, I've always thought that if it's not good enough to get published in the traditional manner,
it's not good enough to get published.
And how many books are self-published that actually become successful?
Yes.
And as I said, we were talking about earlier, there's a process that a book goes through to become ready for publishing.
And there's a reason why it does that. Yeah. One of my big bugbears at the moment is the way the newspaper industry has declined. And of course, there's not the checks, there's not the sub-editing process, there's not the readers to check spelling, punctuation and other factual errors that there used to be.
Yeah.
So mistakes slip through, inaccuracies slip through, and that kind of spoils the reading process.
Yeah.
If you could see glaring errors coming up at you from everywhere.
Yeah, well, certainly I've noticed that with I mean, certainly with websites and that, you click on a website sometimes and it's obviously just someone in their room writing something up, and it's garbage.
Just because
that's creeping into the normal press as well.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, but it's also difficult to know if you should or not until you actually put something out there and get people's feedback. So, but I think that's what stops me all the time, is there's that self-doubt, and then you end up, there's distractions and the self-doubt, and then you think, well, I could sit and write more, or I could just sit and play the PlayStation and not take the risk of rejection.
It is actually, and I suspect people who've never written, and I started my career, as did both my brothers, in newspapers, so I worked for many years in newspapers, and it is actually quite exposing to start writing, and especially when you start to do, so you break away from doing not just news, but you start to do something that's a little bit of an opinion piece. And many years ago I wrote a TV column for the Friday edition of the paper that I then worked for, and it started off being very straight, and here are 10 highlights for your weekend's viewing, and then it became a little bit of my assessment of them, and then that developed into, here's probably the 5 worst things you can see this weekend because I hate them all. But that goes back to the late 1980s, when for people to engage with you, they actually had to write. There was no email, there was no texting, so someone had to get a piece of paper, write something down and send it in.
So some of your true cranks that are going to go to that length, isn't it?
But we did get quite a bit of engagement over the TV column. Quite surprised because I would insult someone's favourite programme, or I remember once saying something about the Eurovision Song Contest and somebody writing in saying that we should be careful because those kind of remarks could cause a political incident. That probably was a crank. But once you start to put your own opinions out there, and it'll be interesting to see how this develops.
Yeah,
and
I'm very aware of that. As you're always going to get negative feedback,
yes.
Especially now it's so easy to give it.
Yeah.
People, I think, throw out negative feedback without really thinking about
exactly.
consequences, or really actually having any valid criticism. But I would say, there's a way you can constructive criticism, which is with writing. That's something I've always struggled. It's like, where do you go? So when you're writing in a newspaper, imagine you've got editors, you work your way up, you get trained in it. I went to university, you got trained up in how to write an essay, you get feedback every essay, and it's like, well, there's not that same structure for a writer, a creative writer.
True.
You could do a creative writing course, which a lot of people do, but
although on a number of occasions I've said to you, let me see some of your work.
I know,
and I'm still waiting.
Well, what I was thinking I'll do is I'll go back and put a load of stuff together.
Yeah.
But the problem is, as well, I've not got anything finished. So it's I'll give you a half-written chapter if you want.
And I'll come back and say, please, I need to know what happens.
Yeah. So I can maybe do that. I could just put together a few different things that I have written, just to see the style even.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I've certainly when I go back and I read stuff now, I can see a lot of progress. Yeah. Even there was a little thing I started writing about a guy in his 20s, kind of mid-20s, and he's living at home with his mum. So that, a bit like me a few years ago, when I was saving up to buy my house, and he's based around a guy I used to work with who was a bit of an oddball, who would jump from one obsession to that. He'd come in one day and he was obsessed with molecular gastronomy.
Oh God!
And then the next day he was talking about tornadoes, and I think it's a very modern phenomenon because of the digital media, and people can jump from one topic to another very easily. Like you're saying, in the past you'd have to write, in the past you'd have to go down to the library, check out a book, and sit and read it. Now you just click on YouTube. So there's the person that's, I like to call him a YouTube intellectual, and they know a lot about nothing. So and he was one of these guys who would come in, and the first met, I thought, this guy's really interesting. He seems like he knows, he's got a lot of interest in hobbies. And I quickly realised that he would just jump from one thing to the other. So the character's based around him, but he's meant to be a sympathetic character. So he's up in his room researching army ants, and he's got the curtains drawn in that, and he's in his underwear and his boxers and everything, and his dressing gown on. It's 2 PM, his mum's shouting on him, and he's getting angry, and that's something I can relate to. My mum would constantly shout up to me, and he'd be like, "Are you up there?" And I said, "Of course I'm up here." So there's that sort of dynamic between him and his mum, and so I started writing that. But when I went back to read it, I realised that just the way it's structured, I need to I have the conversation between him and his mum, and then he goes back to the computer screen to go back. I'm thinking you just have those two together. So he's taking notes, and you describe the ants and that, and you'll have his mum interrupting, which would be much more what it would be like in
real life.
Yeah. So that's something that going back and reading it 6 months later, you're having that bit of time between it. You go back and you think, actually, I like it, but I just need to tweak it.
I need to tweak it and do something slightly different with it.
Yeah, and then in the next scene, he's got this girl round that he fancies, and he's holding in a fart the whole time he's with her. So and he's squirming about, and she's like, are you okay? He's like, yeah, I'm fine. And he's trying to hold in a fart as he's showing her his research project. But I've not decided what the research project is, but this is a big thing he's working on.
And that, the holding in the fart bit, that sounds
Adrian,
very Adrian.
Well, when I read it back, I think you can see Adrian
where
Mole
your influences are coming.
And again, it's the unrequited love, which again with Pandora. So if I ever finish it, which the idea is running through it is that he's in love with this girl and she's not in love with him, and she's just friends with him, she's maybe a bit more sympathetic than Pandora is to Adrian, but he's maybe not as creepy to this girl as
Adrian is to Pandora.
He's not sending sexual poems under her door. But yeah, just from going back and reading it, because I thought I'll go back and read some stuff before we do this, and I can see the progress of my writing much more in the dialogue. It's much more kind of, I would say more snappy. It's more entertaining dialogue, because I used to struggle with,
because dialogue can often be really stilted.
And then so the dialogue and just trying to, and weave the dialogue into the scene more, rather than having a block of description, a block of dialogue, block of description, which is just I suppose the learning process, isn't it? So I'll maybe write that up and you can read that one.
And on which note will we draw this to an end with your promise?
Yes.
That before we do the next one.
Yeah, there we go.
You've done that.
We'll do that in 5 months maybe.
If you're enjoying this podcast, then we'd be delighted if you could leave us a rating and a review. It helps others find our content, and always feel free to share our podcast with your friends.